The great hall of the Valtharan imperial palace was filled with silence. Hundreds of courtiers stood in rows, their tall silver bodies glowing faintly in the dim light. Their bioluminescent markings pulsed slowly beneath their skin like living starlight. Every eye in the room was fixed on the raised platform where Emperor Thalvoran Valtharis sat upon his throne of black crystal. He was old. His glow had faded to a dull shimmer, but his voice still carried the weight of 1,000 conquered systems. "The alliance with the Terran Republic will be sealed in the ancient way," he said. "A union of blood, a marriage." Whispers moved through the court like wind through dead leaves. Everyone knew what was coming. The humans had asked for a political marriage to bind the treaty. It was an old tradition, one the Valthari themselves had practiced for centuries. The only question was which princess would be chosen. In the shadows at the far edge of the hall, Princess Selara Valtharis stood with her hands folded and her face perfectly still. She already knew the answer. She had known it from the moment the treaty was announced. It would be her, it was always her. "I have selected my third daughter, Selara, to represent the Dominion in this sacred union," the Emperor said. His tone was flat. He did not look at her. He never looked at her. The court did not gasp. They did not protest. A few of them smiled. Some covered their mouths to hide their amusement. Selara heard the soft sound of laughter from somewhere near the front, and she did not need to look to know it was her brother. Prince Kale Valtharis leaned toward a group of young nobles and whispered just loud enough for the words to carry. "Let the monkeys have the barren one. Perhaps they can use her as a decoration." The nobles laughed. Selara did not flinch. She had stopped flinching years ago. Among the Valthari, fertility was everything. It was proof of divine favor, a sign that the bloodline was pure and strong. An infertile royal was not simply unlucky. She was cursed. She was broken. She was empty. And Selara had been declared empty at the age of maturity, when the royal geneticists ran their tests and stamped a single word across her file, a word that had followed her like a shadow ever since. Infertile. From that day on, she had become invisible. Her father stopped inviting her to state dinners. Her sisters avoided her as though her condition might spread. The servants whispered behind her back. The courtiers called her the empty one and did not bother to lower their voices. Now her father was doing the only thing she was still useful for. He was throwing her away. She returned to her chambers and began to pack. She did not take much. A few formal robes, a data tablet with her mother's old recordings, a small crystal pendant that had belonged to the only person who had ever loved her, her mother, who had died when Selara was still a child. Her attendant, Rin, stood by the door and watched with tears streaming down her face. Rin was the only person in the entire palace who had ever treated Selara with kindness. She was not noble. She was not important. She was simply good. "My lady," Rin whispered, "this is not fair." Selara closed her case and looked at her. "Fairness is a human word, Rin. The Valthari do not believe in it." The journey to the human border world of Athian 7 took 4 days by slip space. Selara spent most of it alone in her cabin, staring at the stars through the small window. She had read everything she could find about humans. They were short-lived, emotional, loud. They ate cooked animal flesh and drank fermented plant juice. They fought constantly and forgave just as quickly. They were, by every Valthari standard, primitive. She expected the worst. She had prepared herself for rough hands and cold rooms, and the particular kind of cruelty that powerful men showed to women they considered property. When the ship landed and the doors opened, she stepped onto the platform with her chin high and her expression carved from stone. A man stood waiting for her. He was shorter than her by a full head. His skin was brown and weathered, marked with small scars along his hands and jaw. His hair was dark and slightly messy, as though he had tried to comb it and given up halfway through. He wore a clean military uniform, simple and undecorated. but his eyes were what stopped her. They were warm, not calculating, not hungry, just warm. "Commander Ethan Mercer," he said, and extended his hand. "Welcome to Athenian 7. I know this isn't what you chose. I'll do my best to make sure you don't regret it." She stared at his hand. Among the Valthyrai, touching a stranger was considered deeply intimate, almost aggressive. But she had read that humans shook hands as a greeting. It meant peace. It meant trust. She took his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. His skin was rough and warm. He did not bow, he did not kneel. He simply smiled at her and said, "Are you hungry? The food here is terrible, but the company is decent." She did not know what to do with this. There was no ceremony, no branding ritual, no declaration of ownership. He simply walked beside her into the station, pointing out rooms and hallways and introducing her to crew members who nodded and smiled as though she were a welcome guest rather than a political bargaining chip. He showed her to her quarters. They were modest but clean, with a window that looked out over the planet's pale blue mountains. A vase of small yellow flowers sat on the table. "These are yours," he said, "private, locked from the inside. Nobody enters without your permission, including me." She turned to look at him. "Where are your quarters?" "Down the hall, different room." She blinked. "We are not sharing chambers." "Not unless you want to," he said simply. "And even then, that's a conversation, not an assumption." He left her alone after that. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time, waiting for the trick, the trap, the hidden cruelty. It did not come. That night, Ethan Mercer sat alone in his office and opened the classified dossier that the Valthyran embassy had sent along with Selara. It contained her medical records, her genetic profile, her psychological evaluations. Page after page of cold data about a living person, written as though she were livestock. And there, stamped across the front page in bold Valthyrai script, was a single word. Infertile. He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and spoke quietly to the empty room. "We'll see about that." Outside, the pale blue mountains of Athenian 7 glowed softly beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars. And somewhere in her locked room, for the first time in years, Selara Valthyris slept without dreaming of emptiness. 3 weeks passed on Athenian 7, and Selara could not understand the humans. Every morning, Ethan Mercer knocked on her door at the same time. He never entered. He simply knocked twice and said, "Breakfast in 10 if you want it." Then he walked away. If she came, he smiled and pulled out her chair. If she did not come, he never mentioned it. There was no punishment, no cold silence afterward, no record kept of her failures. It confused her deeply. In the Valthyran court, every action had a price. Every word was a weapon. Every kindness was a transaction. But here, among the humans, people did strange and baffling things for no reason at all. She watched a young soldier carry a crying child from a refugee transport ship. The child was not his. The child was not even human. It was a small, green-skinned orally with broken antennae. The soldier held the child against his chest and hummed a soft melody until the crying stopped. Nobody ordered him to do this. Nobody rewarded him for it. He simply did it because the child was afraid. She watched crew members argue loudly in the mess hall about something meaningless, whether a certain earth sport was better played on grass or sand. And then 5 minutes later, they were laughing together and sharing food from each other's plates. She watched Dr. Lena Vasquez, the station's chief xenobiologist, call Ethan a stubborn fool with the strategic thinking of a brick wall during a meeting, and then bring him a cup of coffee an hour later with a small note that read, "You're still wrong, but I made it strong." These people fought with each other, they disagreed, they raised their voices, and then they forgave, instantly, completely, as though the conflict had never happened. Selara had never seen anything like it. Among the Valthyrai, a disagreement between nobles could last generations. Grudges were inherited like titles. but humans seemed to burn hot and then cool down, like small fires that left no ash behind. One evening, she sat alone in the observation lounge, watching the mountains turn gold in the fading light. Ethan found her there and sat in the chair next to her without speaking. They stayed like that for nearly an hour before she broke the silence. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Because you're here and you didn't choose to be." "That is not how alliances work." "Maybe, but it's how people should work." She did not know how to respond to that. So she said nothing, and they sat together in the quiet, and for the first time since arriving, the silence felt comfortable rather than cold. It was Dr. Vasquez who changed everything. Vasquez had been curious about Valthyri biology from the day Saylara arrived. She asked Saylara, politely and never with pressure, if she could run some basic scans. Nothing invasive, just a comparison study between Valthyri and human physiology. Saylara agreed. She had nothing to hide. Her body had already been examined by every geneticist in the Dominion, and they had all reached the same conclusion. She was broken. There was nothing left to discover. Except there was. Vasquez worked for 6 days straight, barely sleeping, living on coffee and determination. She cross-referenced Saylara's genetic data with every xenobiological database humanity had access to. She ran models. She ran simulations. She swore at her computer more than once. On the 7th day, she called Saylara and Ethan into her lab. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking, but not from exhaustion, from something else entirely. "Saylara," she said slowly, "you are not infertile." The room went still. "Your reproductive system has been suppressed," Vasquez continued. "There is a genetic inhibitor embedded in your cellular structure. It was introduced artificially, probably during childhood, possibly through the royal gene therapy program that all Valthyri nobles undergo. Whether it was done on purpose or by accident, I cannot say. But I can say this with complete certainty: your body is not broken. It was shut down." Saylara did not move. She did not breathe. The words entered her mind and crashed against everything she had ever been told about herself, everything she had ever believed. Not broken, shut down. Not cursed, silenced. "Can it be reversed?" Ethan asked quietly. Vasquez nodded. "Human gene editing techniques are different from Valthyri methods. We don't aim for genetic purity. We aim for adaptation. I believe I can design a treatment that removes the inhibitor and allows her system to function naturally. But it will take time, and it will not be easy." Saylara's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her knees to stop them. Her vision blurred, and she realized with a shock that she was crying. She had not cried since she was a child. She had trained herself to stop, to seal every emotion behind a wall of glass and ice, because tears in the Valthyran court were weakness, and weakness was death. But the wall was cracking now. Years of silence and shame and loneliness were pressing against it from the inside, and she could not hold them back. A sound escaped her, not a word, not a scream, but something raw and wounded that had been trapped in her chest for longer than she could remember. Ethan moved closer. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, and waited. She cried for a long time. When it was over, she felt hollow and light, as though something heavy had been pulled from inside her and carried away. "I was never empty," she whispered. "No," Ethan said, "you never were." In the days that followed, Saylara began to change. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was small and slow, like ice melting at the edges. She started eating meals with the crew. She asked Vasquez questions about human medicine. She let Rin, who had come with her from the Dominion, braid flowers into her hair the way human women sometimes did. She told Ethan about her mother, about the lullabies she sang, about the way her bioluminescent markings glowed brighter when she laughed, about the crystal pendant that Saylara still wore against her heart. Ethan listened to every word, and when she was done, he told her about his wife, a woman named Sarah who had died 3 years ago in a pirate raid on a supply convoy. He told her about the garden Sarah used to keep on their balcony, about how she sang off-key while cooking, about the way her absence still sat in the center of his chest like a stone. "Does it get easier?" Solara asked. "No," he said honestly, "but you get stronger, and eventually the weight stops pulling you down and starts holding you steady." She did not fully understand this, but she felt something in his words that she recognized, a kind of truth that existed beyond language, beyond species, beyond the cold distance between stars. One evening, Vasquez came to Solara with a data tablet containing the full treatment plan. She explained every step, every risk, every possible outcome. She held nothing back. "This is experimental," she said. "There are risks. I will not lie to you about that, but I believe it will work." Ethan stood by the door with his arms crossed. He looked at Solara and said, "This is your body, your choice. Not mine, not the Alliance, not the Dominion, yours." Nobody had ever said that to her before. No Valthyri doctor, no royal geneticist, no member of her family had ever once asked her what she wanted done with her own body. They had tested her, examined her, labeled her, and discarded her, all without ever asking her permission. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Vasquez. She looked down at her own hands, long, silver, glowing faintly in the low light. "I want to do this," she said. "Not for the Empire, not for the treaty, for me." Vasquez smiled. Ethan nodded once, and the warmth in his eyes was brighter than any bioluminescent glow she had ever seen. Solara placed her hand over her pendant and felt her mother's memory close to her heart. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own future. The treatment began on a cold morning, when the mountains outside were covered in mist. Dr. Vasquez had spent weeks preparing. She had designed a series of targeted gene editing sequences that would locate the artificial inhibitor buried in Solara's cellular structure and dismantle it piece by piece. It was not a single procedure. It was a long and careful process, 12 sessions spread across 3 months, each one more difficult than the last. The first session was the worst. Solara lay on the medical bed while Vasquez injected the first round of nanite carriers into her bloodstream. Within an hour, she felt a deep, burning ache in her lower abdomen, as though something frozen inside her was being forced to thaw. Her bioluminescent markings flickered wildly, flashing bright and then dimming, bright and then dimming, and she gripped the edges of the bed so hard that her silver knuckles turned white. Vasquez monitored every reading with fierce concentration. Rin stood by the wall, her hands pressed together, whispering old Valthyri prayers under her breath. And Ethan was there. He sat in a chair beside the bed, not touching her, not speaking unless she spoke first. He simply stayed. When the pain made her gasp, he leaned forward slightly. When she closed her eyes and breathed through it, he leaned back. He moved with her rhythm like a tide following the moon. When the session ended and the pain faded to a dull hum, he held out a cup of something warm and brown. "What is this?" she asked, her voice rough. "Tea, earth tea. It tastes terrible, but it helps." She took a sip and immediately made a face that caused Rin to cover her mouth to hide a laugh. Ethan grinned. "Told you." She drank it anyway, all of it. The weeks that followed were hard. Some sessions went smoothly. Others left her bedridden for days, her body fighting against changes it did not understand. There were nights when the pain kept her awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake. On those nights, Ethan would knock on her door, always knocking, never entering without permission, and ask if she wanted company. Sometimes she said no, and he left without argument. Sometimes she said yes, and he would sit on the floor beside her bed and read to her. He had begun learning Valthyri poetry. His pronunciation was awful. He mangled the flowing syllables with his blunt human tongue, turning elegant verses into something that sounded like a drunk man arguing with the wind. It was, without question, the worst poetry recitation in the history of either species. Silara laughed so hard she nearly fell off the bed. She had not laughed like that since she was a child. The sound surprised her. It came from somewhere deep and forgotten, somewhere the Valthuran court had sealed shut long ago, and once it started she could not stop. She laughed until her sides ached, until tears ran down her silver cheeks. Until Ethan was laughing too, his terrible poetry forgotten on the floor. That was the night something shifted between them. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping gesture. It was simply a recognition, quiet and certain, that they had become something more than allies, more than political partners, more than two people pushed together by forces beyond their control. They had become each other's home. The change happened slowly after that, like a sunrise. Silara began reaching for his hand during meals. Ethan began leaving small things outside her door, a book he thought she would like, a sketch he had drawn of the Blue Mountains, a pressed flower from the station's greenhouse. She started calling him by his first name. He started learning the Valthurai word for stay. One night between treatment sessions, they sat together in the observation lounge. The stars were bright and close, and the station hummed softly around them like a living thing. "I want to tell you something," Silara said, "something I have never told anyone." He turned to look at her. He did not push, he simply waited. "My mother gave me a name before she died," Silara said. "A secret name. Among my people, the birth name is the truest part of who you are. Sharing it is the deepest act of trust a Valthurai can offer. It means you are giving someone a piece of yourself that can never be taken back." She paused. The glow beneath her skin pulsed slowly, softly, in time with her heartbeat. "My birth name is Alia." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. She could see something moving behind his eyes, not just understanding, but the weight of what she had given him. "Thank you, Alia," he said softly. Then he told her about the lullaby Sarah used to sing. He did not sing it, he could not yet, but he described the melody, the way it rose and fell like breathing, and how hearing it in his memory still made him feel safe even now. "I have never told anyone about that," he said. They sat together in the starlight, two people from different worlds, holding pieces of each other that no one else would ever see. The treatment continued. Session after session, Vasquez dismantled the inhibitor strand by strand. Silara's body began to change. She felt warmer, stronger. The dull ache that had lived in her abdomen since childhood, so constant she had stopped noticing it, slowly disappeared. Colors seemed brighter. Food tasted richer. She woke one morning and realized she had been dreaming, truly dreaming, for the first time in years. After the final session, Vasquez ran a complete scan. She stared at the results for a long time, scrolling through data, checking and rechecking. Then she turned around and said, "It worked, fully functional, every marker is clean." Silara sat on the edge of the medical bed and pressed her hands against her stomach. She felt nothing different. No spark, no glow, no divine sign. Just herself, whole and working and alive. The rage came later. It hit her at night, alone in her room like a wave she could not stop. She thought of every name they had called her, every cold look from her father, every whispered insult. Every year she had spent believing she was broken, defective, cursed by the stars. And it had been a lie, all of it. Her body had been working the entire time. Someone, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, had turned her off like a machine, and no one in the mighty Valthuran dominion had ever thought to look for the switch. But humans had looked. Humans, with their blunt hands and their crude medicine and their stubborn refusal to accept what they were told, they had looked, and they had found the truth. She pressed her face into the pillow and screamed, not in pain, in fury, in liberation, in the violent, shaking release of a woman who had carried chains so long she had forgotten they were there. When it was over, she felt clean, empty in a new way, not hollow but open, like a room with the windows thrown wide after years of darkness. She found Ethan the next morning in the greenhouse, tending to a small row of earth plants that refused to grow properly in alien soil. He was talking to them, encouraging them, as though they could hear him. She watched him for a moment. Then she walked forward, took his face in both her hands, and kissed him. He was still for exactly 1 second. Then his arms came around her, careful, warm, steady, and he kissed her back. It was not a political union. It was not a treaty obligation. It was two people choosing each other because they wanted to, because they had found something rare and real in the vast cold space between stars. 3 months later, Dr. Vasquez called them both into her lab. Her face was a mixture of shock and joy that she was trying very hard to keep professional. "Sit down," she said. "That bad?" Ethan asked. "That good." Vasquez turned her screen around and showed them the scan results. "Selara, you are pregnant." The silence that followed was enormous. "The child is a hybrid," Vasquez continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Human and Valtheri, first of its kind. And the readings are, I don't know how to explain this, the readings are perfect. Every genetic marker, every developmental indicator, everything is not just normal, it is exceptional. The human DNA is not just compatible with Valtheri genetics, it is stabilizing them, filling gaps that have existed in Valtheri gene structures for centuries." Selara placed her hand over her stomach. Beneath her silver skin, something new was growing, something impossible, something alive. Ethan knelt beside her chair and put his hand gently over hers. "We're going to be parents," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. She looked down at him, this small, scarred, stubborn human who had never once treated her as broken, and the glow beneath her skin burned brighter than it ever had in the cold halls of the Valtheran palace. "Yes," she said, "we are." The news moved through the galaxy like a shockwave. It started as a rumor, whispered between diplomats, passed through encrypted channels, traded in the noisy cantinas of border stations where traders and smugglers drank together and shared things they should not have shared. The Baron Princess of the Valtheran Dominion was carrying a child, a hybrid child, fathered by a human. Within days, it was no longer a rumor. It was the most talked about event in the Galactic Assembly. Species that had ignored humanity for decades were suddenly paying attention. Scientists demanded access to the medical data. Politicians scrambled to understand the implications. News channels across 100 systems ran the story until there was no corner of civilized space that had not heard the name Selara Valtheris. On the Valtheran homeworld, the reaction was very different. Emperor Thalvoran received the news in his private chamber, alone except for his eldest son. He read the report twice, his ancient face showing nothing. Then he set the tablet down and closed his eyes. Prince Kale, who had never learned his father's patience, spoke first. "This is an abomination, a mongrel child in the royal bloodline. We should recall her immediately and—" "Be silent," the emperor said. Kale stopped. The emperor opened his eyes. They were cold and calculating, like the eyes of a predator deciding whether something was food or threat. "The child is a problem," he said slowly, "but it is also an opportunity. The galaxy is watching. If we reject the child, we appear weak and afraid of change. If we claim the child, we control the narrative. We control the science. We control what this hybrid becomes." He picked up the tablet again and began composing a message. "I will summon Selara home, a celebration of new life, a joyful reunion of father and daughter." He paused. "And when she arrives, the royal geneticists will examine the child. We will determine its value, and we will act accordingly." Kale smiled. It was not a kind smile. On Athian 7, the imperial summons arrived on a bright morning. Selara read it standing by the window of her quarters, one hand resting on her swollen belly. The child inside her kicked gently as though sensing her tension. Ethan read the message over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. "It is a trap," she said calmly. "I know. My father does not celebrate, he does not feel joy, he acquires, he controls, he wants the child." Ethan walked to the other side of the room and stood with his back to her for a moment. She watched the muscles in his shoulders tense. When he turned around, his face was calm, but his eyes burned with something she had come to recognize, the quiet, steady fire of a human who had made a decision. "Then we go," he said, "but we go prepared." Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan worked constantly. He sent encrypted messages to Terran Republic Command. He spoke with Admiral Chen, the commander of the border fleet. He held long, quiet conversations with people whose names Selara did not recognize, but whose authority she could sense from the way Ethan's voice changed when he spoke to them. He never told her not to go. He never suggested she hide or run. He understood something about her that she had only recently begun to understand about herself. She was not running away from her past. She was going back to face it, and she would face it standing up. Rin helped her choose what to wear. It was a small decision that carried enormous weight. Selara stood before the mirror in her quarters and looked at 2 outfits, a traditional Valthyri royal gown, silver and flowing, designed to make her look like a pale ghost of the court she had left behind, and a human-style dress, deep blue, simple and elegant, cut to show rather than hide the curve of her belly. She chose the dress. Rin smiled through her tears and adjusted the fabric around Selara's shoulders. "You look like a queen," she whispered. "No," Selara said, "I look like myself." The shuttle landed in the Imperial docking bay, and Selara stepped out into the cold, gleaming light of the Valthyran homeworld. The reception hall was packed. Every noble house had sent representatives. The Imperial Guard stood in perfect rows, their armor polished to a mirror shine. The Emperor sat on his throne with Kale standing at his right hand. And Selara walked through them, all as though they were furniture. She did not bow. She did not lower her eyes. She moved through the silent crowd with her head high and her hand resting on her belly, and every step she took echoed through the vast hall like a heartbeat. Her bioluminescent markings glowed steadily, warmly, with a light that the courtiers had never seen in her before, not the cold flicker of a dying star, but the deep, strong glow of someone fully alive. The Emperor studied her. If he was surprised, he did not show it. He waited until she reached the base of the platform and then spoke in the formal tone reserved for matters of state. "Daughter, you have returned to us bearing new life. The Dominion welcomes you and wishes to honor this occasion. As is tradition, the royal geneticists will examine the child to ensure." "No." The word rang through the hall like a bell. Selara looked directly at her father. Her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the room. "You declared me empty. You stamped my file with a word that followed me through every corridor of this palace, every whisper, every cold look, every dinner I was not invited to. You gave me away to the humans like broken cargo, not as an honor but as an insult. And now you want what grew inside me." She paused. The silence was absolute. "No, father, you discarded me into the hands of humans, and they did what you and your geneticists and your entire empire could not. They saw me. They listened to me. They found that I was never broken at all. I was silenced. By your own technology. By the very gene therapy your doctors administered when I was a child." A ripple went through the crowd. Murmurs, shocked looks. Several geneticists near the back of the hall went very pale. "This child is mine," Selara continued. "This child is Ethan's, and you will not touch either of us." Kale moved first. He raised his hand and signaled to the Imperial Guard. "Seize her. She is clearly unwell. The human influence has corrupted her mind." 4 guards stepped forward. And then the hall's communication system chimed with an incoming transmission on the open diplomatic channel. the channel that every ship, every station, and every government in the Galactic Assembly could hear. Ethan Mercer's voice filled the throne room. "This is Commander Ethan Mercer of the Terran Republic, speaking on behalf of the Terran government and military command. Queen Selara Mercer is a recognized and protected citizen of humanity. The child she carries is a citizen of the Terran Republic." A pause, then quieter but no less firm. "Any attempt to detain her or the child will be considered an act of war, not a trade dispute, not a diplomatic incident. War." The hall erupted. Courtiers spoke over each other. Kale shouted for the transmission to be cut. The guards hesitated, looking to their emperor for direction. Thalvoran raised one hand, and silence fell. He looked at the tactical display that his aide had quietly activated beside the throne. Just outside Valtharai space, holding position with weapons cold but ready, sat a full Terran Republic diplomatic fleet. 12 warships, 3 carriers, an escort of fast-attack frigates. Not firing, not threatening, simply present, simply waiting. The Emperor knew what this meant. The entire galaxy knew what happened when humans were pushed to fight. They did not wage elegant campaigns. They did not negotiate terms mid-battle. They dug in, adapted, and kept coming until the other side broke. Every species in the assembly had studied the human military records, and every species had reached the same conclusion. Do not corner them. Do not take what they love, because they will burn everything, including themselves, to get it back. The Emperor looked at his daughter. She stood before him, glowing with warmth, dressed in human blue, carrying a child that his empire could not have given her. He lowered his hand. "You may go," he said. His voice was thin and very old. Kale stared at him in disbelief. "Father." "I said she may go." Selara looked at her father one last time. She had expected to feel rage. She had expected to feel triumph. Instead, she felt something she had not anticipated. She pitied him. He was an old man on a crystal throne, surrounded by courtiers who feared him and children who served him, and he had thrown away the one daughter who might have loved him if he had ever let her. She turned and walked out of the hall. Rin fell into step beside her, having chosen without hesitation to leave the Dominion forever. The crowd parted before them in silence. As they reached the doors, Selara paused and looked back, not at her father but at the court itself. The silver walls, the cold light, the tall, beautiful, frightened people who had spent their lives measuring their worth by the purity of their blood. Then she turned away and stepped into the warmth of the human shuttle. She did not look back again. The child came into the world on a quiet night when the mountains of Athian 7 were painted white, with the first snowfall of the season. Selara lay in the medical bay with Ethan beside her, holding her hand so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. Dr. Vasquez moved with calm precision, giving orders to her small team in a voice that never wavered. Rin stood near the door, clutching a bundle of soft blankets she had woven herself from earth cotton and Valtharai silk thread, whispering prayers in a language older than the Dominion itself. The labor was long and difficult. Human Valtharai hybrid birth had never been attempted before, and Vasquez had spent months preparing for every complication she could imagine. But in the end, the child decided her own arrival. She came quickly, fiercely, as though she had already grown tired of waiting. The first cry was not the thin wail of a Valtharai infant, nor the full-throated scream of a human baby. It was something in between, clear and bright, like a bell ringing across water. Vasquez lifted the child and placed her on Selara's chest. She was small and perfect. Her skin was silver like her mother's, but warmer, closer to moonlight than starlight. Faint bioluminescent markings traced along her tiny arms and cheeks, glowing softly in the low light of the room. But her eyes, when she opened them for the first time, were dark and deep and unmistakably human. Her father's eyes. Selara looked down at her daughter and felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, but blooming, like a flower forcing its way through frozen ground. "Lyra," she whispered. "Her name is Lyra." Ethan leaned forward and touched his daughter's cheek with one rough, scarred finger. Lyra's tiny hand curled around it and held on with surprising strength. "Lyra Mercer Valtharis," he said. His voice was thick. "Two names, two worlds." In the weeks that followed, the galaxy watched. News of the birth spread even faster than the news of the pregnancy. Every xenobiologist, geneticist, and medical researcher in the assembly wanted access to the data. Vasquez published her findings carefully, sharing enough to satisfy scientific curiosity while protecting Lyra's privacy. The results stunned the academic world. Lyra's genetic structure was not simply a blend of human and Valthari DNA. The human genes had done something unexpected. They had filled in gaps that had existed in the Valthari genome for thousands of years. Weaknesses that the Dominion's gene therapy programs had tried and failed to correct for centuries were simply absent in Lyra's DNA. The human contribution had not diluted the Valthari bloodline. It had strengthened it in ways that no amount of selective breeding ever could. The implications rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Other alien species began reaching out to humanity through back channels. The Orelli Confederation, whose population had been declining for generations, quietly requested a meeting with human geneticists. The Kasari Trade Union, whose ruling class suffered from a hereditary neural condition, asked for access to human medical research. Even the proud Drenathi, who had publicly mocked humans for decades, sent a private diplomatic inquiry about cooperative biological studies. Humanity had been called primitive. Their medicine had been dismissed as crude. Their biology had been classified as unremarkable by every elder species in the galaxy. But nature did not care about classifications, and the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Human DNA was not primitive. It was the most adaptable genetic template any species had ever encountered. Where other races had specialized, narrowing their evolution into perfect but fragile forms, humans had remained flexible, chaotic, and endlessly creative at the cellular level. They were not the pinnacle of evolution. They were its wild card. On the Valtharan homeworld, the consequences were political as well as scientific. Selara's public confrontation with the Emperor had been broadcast across the assembly, and it had cracked something in the foundation of Valthari society. For centuries, genetic purity had been the Dominion's religion. The idea that a contaminated bloodline could produce a child healthier than any pure-blooded royal was not just shocking, it was heretical. Young Valthari began questioning the doctrine openly. Students at the great academies published papers challenging the assumptions of genetic superiority. Protests, small at first, appeared in cities across the homeworld. The old order was not falling, but it was beginning to tremble. Prince Kale denounced Selara publicly, calling her a traitor and demanding her exile be made permanent. But privately, quietly, and through channels so secret that only Vasquez knew about them, Kale's own wife sent a message to Athian 7. She was struggling with the same fertility issues that had plagued Selara. She wanted to know if the humans could help. Vasquez did not hesitate. She said yes. As the months passed, Selara settled into a life she had never imagined for herself. She became a voice, not appointed, not elected, but simply recognized for the growing movement of Valthari who wanted change. She spoke at assembly sessions. She wrote letters that were read by millions. She stood between two worlds and showed them that the space between was not empty. It was full of possibility. Ethan watched her grow into this role with quiet pride. He had never wanted to be a political figure. He was a soldier, a station commander, a man who was happiest when he was fixing broken things and taking care of people. But watching Selara, watching the woman who had arrived on his station, wrapped in silence and shame, stand before the most powerful beings in the galaxy and speak without fear, he felt something he had not felt since Sarah died. He felt like the universe made sense again. Lyra grew quickly. She had her mother's grace and her father's stubbornness. By 2, she was speaking both Valtharai and English, switching between them mid-sentence in a way that delighted Rin and baffled everyone else. By 3, she had figured out how to open every locked door on the station and had to be retrieved from the engine room twice in 1 week. By 4, she had named every plant in the greenhouse and declared the station cat her personal advisor. She was fierce and kind and wildly, beautifully alive. She glowed in the dark like her mother. She laughed like her father, and she feared nothing. Years passed, 5 of them. They were the best years of Selara's life. On a warm afternoon, Lyra was running through the corridors of Athenian 7, her silver skin flashing in the overhead lights, her dark eyes bright with mischief. The station cat, a fat orange creature named General, trotted ahead of her with the dignity of an animal who believed it was in charge. Selara stood at the observation window, watching the mountains beyond the station walls. The mist was low today, curling around the peaks like sleeping breath. Ethan came up behind her and slid his arm around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat against her spine. "A message arrived," he said. She turned her head slightly. "From whom?" "Your father." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mountains did not change. "He is dying," Ethan said gently. "The message came through the Imperial Channel. His physicians say he has weeks, perhaps less." Selara closed her eyes. She thought of the throne room, the cold crystal, the old man who had looked at his daughter and seen nothing worth keeping. "He wants to see Lyra," Ethan continued, "before the end." Down the corridor, Lyra's laughter echoed, bright and clear and completely unaware of emperors and empires, and the weight of dying men's regrets. Selara opened her eyes. She unfolded the message and read it slowly. The words were formal, stiff, written by an aide who had tried to make a command sound like a request. But beneath the careful language, she could sense something unfamiliar, something the emperor had probably never felt before, or at least never allowed himself to feel. He was afraid, not of death, but of dying without seeing what he had thrown away. She folded the message and held it against her chest. She felt the pendant beneath her dress, her mother's crystal, still warm after all these years. "He threw me away," she said quietly. Ethan squeezed her hand. His grip was rough and warm, the same as it had been on the first day she arrived, when he had offered his hand to a stranger and meant it. "And you came back with everything he never deserved," he said. Selara watched Lyra chase the cat around a corner, her laughter filling the corridor like music, her silver glow trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She smiled. It was a warm smile, a human smile, the kind of smile that the Valtharan court had never taught her and that she had learned only by being loved. "Then perhaps it is time he learns what that looks like," she said. She took Ethan's hand and walked toward the sound of their daughter's laughter, toward the life she had built from the pieces of everything she had been told she could never have. Behind her, the mountains of Athenian 7 stood tall and silent in the mist, and the stars above them burned with the patient, steady light of a galaxy that was only just beginning to understand what humans were capable of. Not conquest, not domination, not the cold perfection of ancient empires. Something far more dangerous. They were capable of love, and love, as it turned out, could change everything.